This video is brought to you by Squarespace. I wouldn't call these teams bad or hateful or anything like that. I would call their downfalls, sad. As you could feel for these teams, looking through history, but at the time, oh no, they totally deserved it. The first of these 7 teams, I would throw Williams into the mix, but I will throw an asterisk here. I'm talking about the Frank Williams arc of this team, not the team we know as Williams, which arrived from 2021. For the purposes of this video, we're looking at the OG Williams, the pre-Dorilton Capital Williams. We're talking about Williams Grand Prix engineering from 1977 through 2020. Once the gold standard of privateer Formula One teams, one you could easily describe by the likes of the Ferrari body as one of the garagistes. But it did turn out to become a legacy team in of itself, with many years of a heritage bonus, and it's one of the big 3. Not to mention, it epitomized technical innovation and engineering wizardry for about 2 decades, all the way from their start in 77, through their first championship with Alan Jones, giving Clay Regazzoni a new lease of life after he left Ferrari. And then all the way up through 1997, it was a host for many reputable drivers, with Nigel Mansell, Damon Hill, gave Alan Prost a good swan song, and then of course, Jacques Villeneuve getting a world championship in only his 2nd season. Which maybe will explain why he's a bit salty about Oscar Piastri, who's also looking to get a world title not that long into his own career. And throughout all of that, Williams secured several constructors' titles, drivers' titles. There are lots of prestige to be had with that team, and it was a remarkable run of form. However, as we started to see throughout the 90s, there were cracks beginning to form, and it all had something to do with a power complex from the likes of Patrick Head, the lead engineer, and Frank Williams. And it all started with Adrian Newey wanting to have a say, those two, Head and Williams, promising it, and then reneging on it. And then making decisions that were executive and would undercut many of their big stars. Nigel Mansell, anybody? Damon Hill, anybody? Who would then, in revenge, get world championships before then bouncing? Oh, in a way, it was karmic. They deserved it. And then, 2000s, oh boy. Because their partnerships with engine suppliers like Honda and Renault were legendary. They pushed the boundaries of F1 tech as well. And even with their time with BMW in the 2000s before they became their own team, it was notable. But it could easily have been so much more had Head and Williams kept to themselves, and they ultimately did more harm than good and meant that talent would escape the team. But then after that strong run in the 2000s, cracks began to show, culminating in BMW defecting. And then after BMW left, it was all downhill from there. Nico Rosberg did his best to hold the fort all the way through 2010, but then when Mercedes arrived, he checked out. There was a little bit of a blip when Mercedes arrived to provide them as a customer engine. 2014, they managed to sup from the turbo hybrid teat that was Toto's team for a couple of years, a solid 3rd, 4th place in the constructors, not too bad, but it was a false dawn because that car, aerodynamically speaking, was an absolute boat. They didn't innovate. As became clear under Vowles, they were running processes that were cutting edge 20 years ago. They didn't change, they didn't evolve, and they got really cliquey and weird and almost incestuous. Not even the money from Papa Stroll could breathe new lease of life into the team. Things had gotten stale, and it led to, before they got bought by Dorilton Capital, with them finishing in last place 3 seasons in a row. And them not even scoring double figures in those 3 years. So ultimately, under the stewardship of Claire Williams, with Frank Williams watching on, they had no choice but to sell. They did to Dorilton Capital, they got their money, they left in really negative terms, and it's only now where we're starting to see the Williams family coming back to the main team. Next up are the likes of the Lotus team. Now, some of you more recent fans may be a little bit confused. Which Lotus team am I talking about? Am I talking about the Lotus that was owned by Proton, the Tony Fernandez Lotus before they changed to Caterham? Nah, none of those, because both of those entities, apart from that year with Kimi, were terrible. Absolute facsimiles of the glory days of Colin Chapman's Lotus. That's the one I'm talking about today. Team Lotus, founded by Colin Chapman. The proper organisation, which was among F1's most revered teams, winning many team titles, many drivers' championships, and arguably the first Titans of the Constructors' Championship, which started in 1958, and were the ones that early on could go toe-to-toe with Ferrari regularly, often beating them. And I mentioned technical innovation on the Williams side of things. Oh no, Lotus wrote the book. What an F1 car looks like today, you can thank the efforts of the Lotus 72. There were so many concepts throughout a decade, throughout the entire 1970s, which Emerson Fittipaldi took to his first world title with them, and Mario Andretti later on in that decade, that became commonplace. Ground effect, anybody? The side pods being a thing, as we know? How F1 cars evolved were defined by Chapman and his crew. Even how we see them with sponsors and how Formula One teams are funded, because before 1968 and Lotus Gold Leaf, it was all about national colours. So you did get names like Jim Clark, Graham Hill, Jochen Rindt, Mario Andretti and Ayrton Senna gracing their machine. And they stood at the cutting edge for decades. But going into the 1980s, as we saw, thanks to Bernie Ecclestone's globalization efforts, the team looked really rudderless, not helped by Colin Chapman's death in 1982, taken way before he deserved to. Couple that with management instability, so almost like some kind of power vacuum, no one's really kinda sure who's in charge, it meant that during the early 1980s, Lotus were lacking a sense of direction or somebody who could steer them technologically speaking. The turbo era at the beginning was just not kind to them. They looked like complete no-hopers, and sure, there were flickers of brilliance in the mid-80s when Ayrton Senna arrived, and then Honda came in with a works deal after them getting a little bit uncomfortable and annoyed with the likes of Williams. And they did get a couple of good sponsors, Camel supporting them after the John Player Special years ended, but then unfortunately that faded away too when McLaren came along and Ayrton Senna went along with them as well, and then we had the Judd effect. And if you're not too familiar with the Judd effect, then Judd is usually a death sentence for any privateer team, because sure, it's an engine, it works, it goes forward, it's not very good though. I mean, I know it's a private effort, they try their best, but they can't hold a candle to even the Cosworth DFV. It meant that sponsorship dried up, results failed, the team failed to secure any more works deals after that, and they failed to score at all in their final season in 94. Their finals, it just was a seismic loss in 95 when they suddenly closed doors. A once revolutionary team, they succumbed to financial pressures. And 1994 was just sad. That Lotus livery was just a patchwork of various tiny sponsors that would come and go. It was absolutely miserable. And it's not like they had bad drivers, because they had one last parting gift, providing Johnny Herbert a platform, but that's not the main talking point. We're talking about giving Mika Häkkinen his start in Formula One, before then going to McLaren, and then the rest is history, under Ron. Now, before we continue, a quick shout out to Squarespace for sponsoring today's video. If you're like me and maybe want to build your own site in an easy-to-use fashion, which is really quick and simple, then Squarespace is your answer. Even with niche topics such as, well, ladders, because Squarespace makes it simple. Their Blueprint AI gives you personalized design ideas in minutes, and the drag and drop editor means you don't need to know code to make your site look great. Everything is integrated, including built-in SEO tools like meta descriptions, automatic site naps, so your site's ready to be found. Squarespace means that selling your products or sharing your story is easy, lickety-split, donzo. It means you can focus on what you do best. Me talking and yapping on ladders. Try it free at squarespace.com, and when you're ready to launch, use squarespace.com/LawVS for 10% off your first purchase of a website or domain. Cheers, Squarespace! Now let's get back to it. Nan Brabham. This one was quite sad. However, unlike Lotus, who managed to bob around the midfield as they fell to pieces, Brabham really fell down hard. You could even argue that come the 1980s, the outfit was nothing like when they were first founded by Jack Brabham. A very lithe, small organisation that could easily go toe-to-toe with the likes of Ferrari, especially in their Repco configuration. That engine was pretty potent, not to mention incredibly reliable, in an era of Formula One where reliability could go hang if your car didn't have enough power. But Jack Brabham proved them, the Titans, wrong. They burbled along for a while, and then when Bernie Ecclestone took over in the 70s and 80s, their grandeur really skyrocketed. And come 1981, they got another world title in the form of Nelson Piquet, and then again in 1983, especially with a BMW deal, all before Bernie Ecclestone got wrapped in the idea of taking F1 across the world and formalising and unifying absolutely everything. Because if you look in the history of Formula One, before Ecclestone came along and made everything uniform and formulaic, it was a patchwork of deals, and that's why the season reviews only really started properly in 1981. Before then, you just had to take whatever footage you could find. If you look back to the 1970 period of all the DVDs, which I do have by the way, it's an absolute mess. Some races omitted entirely because no one was there to film it, or they couldn't get the rights for the DVD makers to produce it. They also got renowned for their own innovations, such as the fan car, hydropneumatic suspension, and audacious strategy. And then of course they got those titles, but after that, things began to splutter to a halt. Technical regulation changes, financial mismanagement, Kel's surprise, and the loss of key staff and sponsors to other teams left them adrift. And by the mid-1980s, when it was looking very clear that turbos were going to be banned and you had normally aspirated engines taking up the charge, BMW essentially, because they weren't really pulling their own weight in terms of reliability, they just went like, nope, and they left, leaving Brabham to then succumb to the Chad effect. You went from a team that was winning races and going for titles to a team that could not even qualify, and they were stuck in pre-qualifying. What an absolute come down. It's tragic and depressing. And then, in their final year, it doesn't even look like a BMW Brabham, white and dark blue. It was like blue, pink, darker blue. And yes, sure, it gave Damon Hill a platform in which to then go to Williams in 1993, but that was it. That was all they had. Bernie Ecclestone had abandoned them. There was no management that was worth speaking of. It was just an absolute mess that was a shadow of its former self. If only there was some kind of legacy project that could bring Brabham back to what was in the 1960s, it would be spectacular. At least Lotus had class and were plucky all the way to the end. Goes to show what you can lose if you lose a really strong-willed leader. Much like you could argue that Benetton had a very strong-willed leader. And even though Alpine has got that same leader right now, it's not proving very effective at all. And yes, I know this is technically talking about Team Enston, and they did find success in the 2000s again, but we're talking about the Benetton OG period. Because when they took over Tolman, they were just about hanging on to the midfield after tasting success with Ayrton Senna, but surprisingly quickly, when they took over roles with BMW and then later with Ford, things were picking up. By the time Briatore came along as the team principal, they looked fairly competent, right in touch with the top runners. All thanks to that savvy management team and the talents of Michael Schumacher, who won titles in 94 and 95, and they were noted for their multicultural atmosphere, technical innovation, Benetton, and willingness to challenge the status quo. Sort of like the prototype to when Red Bull came along and tried to mix up things in a similar fashion. Not many paid mind to Benetton when they first arrived. I mean, can you blame people? Because it was a clothes company taking over an F1 team. Much like how people derided Red Bull for coming in, they were only a drinks company who maybe dabbled in extreme sports, but they quickly proved people wrong, and Benetton did exactly the same thing. No wonder Christian Horner and Flavio really like each other, and why there's such a rumour regarding Briatore snatching Horner for Alpine. They would be in synergy. And by the way, Briatore was a manager of one of those Benetton clothes stores, and look where he ended up. The 1990s proved to be an absolute giant killer era, and they proved to become giants themselves, but it all fell apart once Michael Schumacher had honoured his contract and then went off to Ferrari, and then took many other people with him, including the likes of Ross Brawn and Rory Byrne. 1996 proving to be a really awkward year. Sure, they managed to get two Ferrari drivers in Alesi and Berger, who were replaced by Schumacher and Irvine, but they did the best they could in a car that was mainly developed for Schumacher. Reliability started to fall to pieces, and it was a very steady decline, and they were able to get podiums for a couple more years, but they became more fleeting. And even though Mild 7 stuck around to the bitter end as a sponsor, other sponsors were harder to find, and come 2001, the team looked miserable and barren. So yeah, Renault did save the day, but that was 2001, the final year where Benetton were truly a privateer team. You could argue that maybe the Lotus years were where they were privateers, but Renault still had a stake in the team, albeit very, very small, so it's debatable on that front. But it just goes to show there was a dramatic downturn in performance that within the space of 5 years, you would go from leading the constructors to barely being able to hand on to 7th. And it ultimately capped out on a buyout and the erasure of a team's identity, one that had been around since the mid to late 80s, and that was a real crying shame. It was a really jarring exit and kind of depressing. And another depressing exit was like with Jordan, another fan favourite, and a stark indicator in how the 2000s were becoming an inhospitable place for private teams. With Jordan Grand Prix, the team was centred around the man of the same name, quickly gaining a reputation as the paddock's maverick underdog, winning races and challenging for titles with limited resources with a decade of establishment. And Jordan weren't a bunch of no-hopers either. Right from their very first season, they looked incredibly competent. Not only was the Jordan 191 a design classic and still is to this day, it was actually a pretty good car. Not bad for a team that had been knocking around the junior categories such as Formula 3000. They really made the step up quite competently, and it really helped with Michael Schumacher knocking around as well, giving him his debut. And then in the mid-90s, they were destined to be midfielders, but at not one point did they look like they were going to be propping up the back. And then it all culminated in the late 90s with Heinz-Harald Frentzen being third in the Drivers' Championship for 1999, and the team bagging multiple wins and looking like they were going to have a Drivers' World Champion, Frentzen being an outside contender. And this being powered by the likes of their deal with Mugen Honda. Yeah, it wasn't a Works Honda deal per se, but it was as good as before Honda came back in 2000 with BAR. And then things started to get complicated, and arguably, I'll get the foam out for this one, that partly why Jordan fell to their demise was because, well, they were showing up BAR Honda, which was arguably the arrangement that Honda back in Japan were more in bed with than the likes of Jordan. Even though Jordan got somewhat of a works deal in 2002, and they had Takuma Sato in there, Takuma then went over to BAR in 2003, and then Jordan lost the deal in 2003. They had to rely on Ford because the Judd effect no longer existed, thankfully. But it just all fell to pieces from 2003. It was a shame, really, because it provided a platform for the Schumacher brothers, Eddie Irvine, Rubens Barrichello, and retirement homes of Damon Hill and Martin Brundle. But as F1 costs spiraled, Jordan just couldn't keep up. Then for a few years, the team changed hands twice before settling with Force India, and now becoming Aston Martin, and has thankfully grown and evolved since then to become in rude health and with huge facilities, aided effectively by the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. Jordan had made its mark, and it's really sad that Eddie has been taken away from us. He was such a character, and he really did define the privateer era as it was very much being rubbed out, Williams being the only major bastion. They were the plucky underdogs. Force India arguably survived even though the name had changed, that they were able to punch above their weight many times, taking names and podiums, even though they were vastly smaller than Ferrari, Mercedes, Red Bull, what have you. But it was just a tragic downfall, that it was inevitable, and it just makes you think that if only Honda had stuck with them for that little bit longer, or maybe put more faith in the organisation. If only, man, if only. And now this one is kind of a two-stage affair. Not only did we see Prost fall apart, but we saw the withering of a French mainstay before then, Ligier. Founded in 1976 by former racer Guy Ligier, the team soon became the pride of French motorsport. And not too long after they debuted in the late 70s, they went on to win races and contend for the constructors. In 1980 and 81, they were amongst the top 3 or 4 teams. It was looking likely they were on a trajectory to be world-class frontrunners for many years to come, even though for a long time they only ever fielded one car. Unfortunately, though, they peaked very early on, and then after that, they did fall back into the midfield, and they continued to slip and slip and slip until they were pretty much 6th, 7th, 8th, right at the bottom of the midfield. And come the 1990s, the team's fortunes had waned amid financial troubles and diminishing manufacturer support. Then the arrival of 4-time champion Prost offered them some hope, and it was billed as a renaissance and then changing to Prost GP. Hopes were sky high that a French super team could be birthed from the ashes of the previous one, but reality bit hard. The efforts of Alain soon proving to be insufficient. A lack of technical leadership, the inexperience of Alain Prost in leading a team because, well, he'd won 4 championships, so therefore that made him perfectly qualified, because not even Niki Lauda could do a decent job of it at Jaguar, him being a special advisor to Toto, who at least kind of knew what he was doing and had people around him. But the fact remained that Prost never really got off the ground, it never really got into the top of the midfield or contending the front runners. It had a podium or 2 throughout its career, but yeah, it wasn't to be, unfortunately, them carrying on the torch of Ligier. By 2001, Prost GP collapsed amidst bankruptcy despite a last-minute deal with Ferrari for power units. The team's demise was especially poignant. Ligier's long history and initial optimism around Prost's leadership, it just made their abrupt exit feel like France's success in F1 was coming to an end. And it certainly didn't help that Jean Alesi retired that very same year. I could imagine that if you were a French Formula 1 fan, 2001, that wasn't a good year. But hey, at least Renault came back in 2002 and they won some titles. You know, something. And then lastly, Tyrrell. What a way to go, man. That one of your final drivers was Ricardo Rosset, a driver so hated by the likes of Ken Tyrrell, it forced the guy, a legend in Formula 1 and privateer teams, to quit before the season had barely started. But yes, Ken Tyrrell's name is one not to ignore, and it really kicked off a movement that really defined the 1970s in terms of competition, him cutting his teeth as the team principal of Matra alongside Jackie Stewart, them together winning the first of the Scotsman's titles. Because, don't forget, Jackie Stewart didn't win all 3 titles with Tyrrell, although he did win all 3 titles led by Tyrrell. After going it alone, the team quickly, and I mean really quickly, became a powerhouse, winning 2 further drivers' titles and 2 constructors' titles in the early 70s. And they were famed for their own spells with innovation, such as the 6-wheeler, which turned out to be better than many people feared, and for discovering young talent, including Stewart, Jody Scheckter, Jean Alesi. You could also throw in the likes of Francois Sever, a name who was tragically taken from us too soon, prompting the retirement of Stewart himself. But it all completely fell to bits come the early 80s, that being their last ever win, and then there was a brief uptick with the likes of Jean Alesi troubling the likes of Ayrton Senna, but Tyrrell simply couldn't hold on to Alesi for much longer. He got poached by Ferrari. And by the 80s and 90s, F1's financial landscape had shifted. Yeah, Formula 1 was definitely saved by the likes of Bernie Ecclestone in keeping things regulated and consistent and global, increasing the popularity of it, but those small privateer teams could not be nearly as agile and profitable, lucrative and successful. The might of major manufacturers or teams that could get works deals, it was mighty. Tyrrell just simply couldn't cope. And bigger budgets amongst the turbo era really didn't help, leaving some teams struggling to adapt. Tyrrell being part of a really bizarre little championship within a championship, and even though they won it, because they only had normally aspirated engines, it was a bit of a Class B Formula 1.5 sort of thing. And they struggled to attract top sponsors either. Results dwindled, and ultimately, come 1998, the deal was done. They got bought out by British American Tobacco, and the name was dropped for 99. Even though Tyrrell kept on fighting throughout the 90s, and yeah, they weren't exactly a bunch of no-hoopers, come 1998, they were absolutely exhausted. There was just nothing to smile about. 1999, when they did get bought out by BAR, it wasn't much better either. They didn't score that year either. But there is a nice little twist at the end of all of this, is that ultimately you could pin Mercedes' success all the way back to the Tyrrell years, because Tyrrell got bought out by BAR, and then BAR got bought out by Honda, Honda then sold it to Braun, Braun then sold it to Mercedes, and the cycle repeats itself. So Tyrrell, in a way, still lives on, and became really successful, albeit in a very indirect, ancestral sort of way. And look, I'm sure that this list will be added to in the years to come, that there'll be more teams that will rise and then fall tragically, but this is what I got for you right now, and I thank you for getting to the end of this video. And if you're really interested to learn more or watch some more of my content, then I think maybe this video could be your liking. I'll see you over there.